Well, hi there. I'm here today with a snake, which might not make sense to some of you, but I'll make sense of it here in a moment. But what I want to talk to you about is coronavirus, which is something that we all know about because we're all dealing with it together. But I want to explain it a little bit more. I'm not a virologist. I don't study pandemic diseases or anything like that, but I am a biologist, and so a lot of the things that you're hearing about in the media probably make more sense to my ears than they might to yours. So as many of you probably know, coronavirus, this at least most recent strain, COVID-19, began in Wuhan province in China, probably in the wet markets there, which are disturbing. If you've ever seen footage of these markets, I mean, there are just dead and dying animals everywhere that people are eating, and they're oftentimes animals that you don't normally think about us eating, but people do eat them. This is relevant because COVID-19 is of zoonotic origin, which means it came from other species of animals and jumped to humans, and this jumping is something I'll explain in a minute. It was at one point thought that it might have come through snakes. And if you've seen these markets, they are butchering and eating a lot of snakes at these markets, but it turns out probably had nothing to do with snakes. That is, though, why I'm handling a snake. This is Buttercup, and I love her. But it probably originated, well, it almost certainly originated in bats. So this is a bat disease. It's a disease that they deal with. They've got a decent amount of immunity. It's at low levels in bat populations, probably all the time. And in this case, it looks to have come through a vector that is a pangolin, which is one of the coolest animals in the world, and it's a shame that people are eating them, and apparently this is how the pangolins are getting their revenge. So I want to talk about how it is that viruses jump, and this has nothing to do with literal jumping. The reality is, if you're around another organism, you're being exposed to some of the pathogens that it may have with it. So if you're around a sick snake, for example, say a snake with a respiratory infection, you're being exposed to those pathogens. It's just that viruses, for example, viruses are weird because they're only sort of arguably alive. And one of the things that living things generally do that viruses can't do is reproduce themselves. Viruses are incapable of reproducing themselves. They can only reproduce by hijacking the cellular machinery of cellular organisms like snakes or people in order to make more of themselves. And this actually tends to cause a lot of issues for whatever that host is, and that's why you get sick. It's partially because of what it's doing to you and partially because of your immune response trying to kill off that virus. But the reality is you're being exposed. Those viruses are jumping to you from snakes all the time. It's just that they can't really function in your body. They can only sort of work with a fairly narrow range of hosts, like a few snake species closely related to, say, Buttercup here. Those could be affected, but not from snakes to humans, usually. Unless there's an oddball. And what I mean by an oddball is a mutant who is so different that it can infect either both snakes and humans, or maybe just humans, and it happens to get introduced to you. Humans and snakes are so different from one another that there aren't very many of these zoonotic diseases that jump from snakes to humans. It happens much more often with organisms that are a whole lot more like humans genetically and in terms of their physiology, or just sort of how their bodies function. So things like rodents and primates, which are fairly close relatives to humans, those things carry a lot of diseases that can jump fairly easily from the rodent or the primate to humans because it's not a big leap. Additionally, something that happens a lot are jumps from livestock, that domesticated livestock and pets like cats and dogs, just animals that are not terribly different in their physiology from human beings and with which we interact on a very regular basis. And so just the amount of exchange of viruses, for example, that happens between these animals is really high, and that virus doesn't need to be terribly different before it can infect a human. And so jumps tend to happen fairly often. Those are the most common jumps. Jumps from reptiles to humans, pretty darn rare. For this reason, whenever I do a reptile program, like with Buttercup here, Buttercup is usually the first animal I show to people. She is such a sweetheart, nicest snake you'll ever see in your life. She's the first snake a lot of people have ever touched. And when I have them touch her, I mention to them that if they touch a reptile today, it would be a very, very good idea to wash their hands afterward. And this is why, is because there's always the potential she could have something on her that could jump to you. Unlikely, but it could happen. But I also mentioned to them that there's another animal that's here today that can carry every disease a human can get. They're called people. And so I'm always really clear, if you've touched a reptile today, it's a good idea to wash your hands. If you've touched a person, definitely wash your hands. In the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, if you go to Kakariko Village in the middle of the night, over by the well, there's this strange little fellow, and if you click on him, he says, "People are disgusting. My own father and mother are disgusting. You must be disgusting too." Seemed like an odd line when I was a kid, but turns out he was spot on. He was exactly right. People are potentially carrying all kinds of horror that doesn't need to jump to get to you. You already can get it. Which is why we're needing to be so careful right now about our interaction with other human beings, because among the host of things they could potentially be carrying, this form of coronavirus that has been able to jump from bats to humans, possibly through a pangolin intermediate, that is now a strain that is out there in large numbers, and it can go from human to human to human to human to human, no problem. It seems to do this mostly through either the air or through surfaces that infected people have touched. Sometimes they can be infected for several days before they even realize they have it. In order to diagnose somebody as actually having this COVID-19 coronavirus strain, what they do is something called reverse transcription PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. That's a pretty crazy title, so I'm going to break that down for you a little bit. Transcription is something that happens in your cells, and it's where your DNA gets copied into a cheaper version of DNA called RNA, which is one-sided, and it uses a slightly different nucleotide called uracil. But don't even worry about that. It's just, RNA is sort of a cheaper version of DNA. It's a one-sided, cheaper version. Well, the thing about DNA is it's usually got two strands, and the strands line up. There's multiple units called nucleotides, and they line up with the complementary ones. And so if you knew what one side looks like, you could actually create the other side, and that's actually how DNA is copied. And that's also how they make these cheaper RNA copies to send out into the cell to do things. That's how the message from the DNA gets sent out into the cell. Well, viruses use RNA as their genetic code, so they've got one-sided RNA. And so this reverse transcription just means that you make a DNA copy of RNA, which is the opposite of what happens in the cell, and so that's why it's called reverse transcription, because it's the reverse of what happens in the cells. And they make a DNA copy, and then they use something called polymerase chain reaction, which is just, they do this to amplify DNA. All that means is they're making a ton of copies of that DNA sequence. So they'll make it DNA instead of RNA, and then they make copy after copy after copy after copy, and so much of it that you can actually see the DNA. And then they'll do something called electrophoresis, which what it allows you to do is there will be a distinctive banding pattern for a given genome. And so you can compare it to known COVID-19, and if it has the exact same banding pattern, you know, okay, that absolutely is COVID-19. If it's different, then it's something else, right? You might just have the flu. Because the symptoms that you have from this are things like fever, and dry cough, really things that are not that unusual to have this time of year. And so just because you're showing those symptoms, it doesn't mean you have coronavirus. To test it and really know for sure, they need to do this reverse transcription PCR, though there are other ways to be kind of sure. So faster, cheaper ways would be to just look at your symptoms, look at your risk factors. They'll do a scan of your lungs, and then they can be fairly confident whether or not you have coronavirus. But the only way to know for sure, reverse transcription PCR. So now that we kind of know what it is and how it jumped to humans, I want to talk about why it's concerning, because it is very concerning. First of all, it is a pandemic, and that's kind of a scary word. All that really means is that there are large numbers of infected people all over the world, on various continents. That makes it a pandemic, as opposed to like a localized epidemic, which is what you tend to see with things like the Ebola virus, which tends to be really severe in a small area. This is becoming a very big deal globally. And one of the things about this being a virus is it means that most antibiotics are not going to have any effect on it at all. Though it does look like there's some potential that we're going to have some big breakthroughs with some malaria treatments that really, really might help with the symptoms. They might actually help to knock out the virus. Most antibiotics, though, have no effect at all. And so usually, the way that you deal with a virus is you treat the symptoms. So like, if you're having trouble breathing, they'll put you on a respirator. They're going to give you things to bring your fever down so you don't cook yourself to death. They're going to do things to treat your symptoms while your immune system develops what's called an acquired immunity, which, it's sort of like, anybody who's ever had chickenpox, you usually only get chickenpox once, and it's because your body develops an acquired immunity to that virus, so when you're exposed again in the future, it kills it immediately, and that's actually why you eventually get better from the chickenpox as well, is eventually you have that acquired immunity. That's the bad way to get an acquired immunity, though, because it means you have to get the disease and you have to survive. That is actually why vaccinations are the preferred way to go, because a vaccination allows you to get that same acquired immunity, but without ever manifesting those symptoms, so you don't have to see if you die or not when you get it. You just never get it, but you develop that immunity. One thing that is really important to mention with this disease, because sometimes you'll hear that the death rate isn't that high compared to things like the Ebola virus, but the death rate is definitely not everything. In fact, it's because of the high death rate with the Ebola virus that the Ebola virus doesn't tend to spread very fast. What happens is it infects a few people, and before they can even get out to infect other people, it kills them because it is so lethal. And you might remember a few years ago we had a scary version of the Ebola virus come through, and the reason that it was so frightening was because it was less lethal. It took longer to kill people, and it didn't kill as many people, and so it was able to spread a lot more than most strains of the Ebola virus. This disease, though, it has a very high death rate compared to things like the flu. Right now we've got some estimates at like 0.6%, which means, like 6 out of 1,000 people that would get it would die, which, doesn't seem that concerning, but it's actually really difficult for us to nail down. And even 0.6% can be a big deal. It may be way higher than that, though. It's hard to figure out the exact death rate because we don't really know how many people have it. We don't know how many mild cases there have been. It's pretty clear when people die from it, but we don't know how many total people there were. And so the death rate is essentially of the people that get it, what percentage die. We don't know how many have had it. So it might be lower or it might be higher because a lot of the people that will die haven't died yet. And so if you just look at the people that have recovered compared to the people that died, it doesn't look good, but a lot of the people are still recovering and they will recover. It seems to be very transmissible, which just means that it spreads very quickly. If you're exposed, there's a very high chance that you get it, which makes this a really, really big deal. Because, for example, if 40% of all people on Earth get it, which is actually sort of a low-end estimate by a lot of accounts, say 40% end up getting this disease at 0.6%, that's going to be like 18 million people that will die of coronavirus. It's close to 1 million people just in the United States. And that is a tremendous shock for the world to experience, to have that kind of death occur in a season. And if we overrun our hospitals, which is probably the biggest concern, that could be much, much higher, 0.6%. It won't even be close to that. Because if we don't have enough hospital beds, then we can't treat the symptoms anymore to help people survive it. They're going to die of symptoms that they could have survived had they been able to get treatment, but there's just not enough medical personnel, there's not enough beds, there's not enough hospitals, there's not enough hours in the day to treat them all. And so the death rate will go much, much higher. It could be a case like what we're seeing in Italy right now, where their hospitals are overrun and we're seeing a death rate 10% at least. The reality is among cases that have recovered, it's pushing 50%. So if we overrun our hospitals, the threat goes way higher. And so, of course, the question we should all be asking is, how do we stop it? Because obviously we don't just want to let it go. Well, the first thing that we do is we sequence its genetic material, this RNA that we referenced before, and we find out where it falls into the phylogenetic tree of viruses that we know about. This is stupendously useful because as soon as we know where they fit in with the other viruses, based on what we know about their close relatives, we will suddenly know a ton about this virus. So when this first appeared, this was like the first thing that was done. So suddenly we go from knowing nothing about this virus to knowing a heck of a lot about this virus. And that is the power of phylogenetics. And I would love to talk about phylogenetics more in the future. So if you'd like a whole video about how to interpret and understand phylogenetic trees, please let me know in the comments. After we know about it, the next thing is going to be about figuring out a way to become immune. And I want to talk about the difference between acquired immunity and natural immunity, because this is important. We talked earlier about acquired immunity. This is what happens as your immune response changes because you've either had it or you've received a vaccine for this virus. So it comes from some sort of exposure to this virus in the past, which means you've either got to get it or we've got to have a vaccine. Natural immunity is a different thing. Natural immunity is just that some people are so different from other people that they're not susceptible to this virus. And that is just by nature of the genes with which they were born. They essentially have it or they do not. It's on these sorts of genes that natural selection tends to play. So events like the bubonic plague actually shifted the relative abundance of some of these immunity genes to things like the bubonic plague, because essentially the people that didn't have it died. They weren't immune. And the immune people were much more likely to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on to the next generation. We don't know how many people right now have a natural immunity to this, but given how quickly it spreads, seems like it's a fairly low percentage. And so if we're going to stop it, we need to develop an acquired immunity. Obviously, it might not be possible for everybody to get this acquired immunity, especially if everybody has to get the disease, because there are some people that are in high-risk groups. They've got pre-existing conditions, they're elderly, and these sorts of things greatly increase the probability of dying from this disease. And so we don't want everybody to get it. What we need to get to is a threshold known as herd immunity. And this is the point where such a large percentage of the population, not everybody, but a large enough percentage of the population is immune so that it's difficult for a person who's infected to infect very many other people before it just runs its course in them. If you get to a high enough level of immune people, the disease just can't spread very far, very fast, and it tends to just die off. So it's herd immunity that beats it. This is why things like the smallpox have disappeared. Smallpox used to be a huge big deal, right? But as soon as we had a vaccination for it, we could have acquired immunity in a large enough percentage of the population that it vanished entirely. And it's only been in the last generation or so when we're like, smallpox? Why am I getting a vaccine for smallpox? That doesn't exist. Turns out it does, still in the world. And it's started to get back in because a lot of people are like, well, I don't need to get the vaccine then. And we don't have herd immunity anymore. So there are two big questions. First of all, how do we get there? How do we get to this point of having herd immunity so this disease can actually basically vanish? And how do we minimize the death rate in the meantime? Minimizing deaths requires that we minimize infections, at least in those high-risk groups. And this is really important, that we don't overwhelm the capabilities of our healthcare systems. There are multiple approaches being discussed, and I want to talk to you about several of them. One of them is to test everyone. Find out exactly who the people are who have COVID-19 and really, really lock them down and quarantine them extremely, and then allow everybody else essentially to go about their business. This will work pretty darn well if you have the capability to test everybody. That has been the challenge. This approach won't stop COVID-19 because there are still going to be people in the world that are going to have it, but it will slow it down. A second approach is essentially to lock down everybody. Just minimize social interaction as much as possible. It won't stop the disease because we can't keep everyone on Earth in solitary confinement for multiple weeks. But it will slow it down. Slowing it down matters partially because if we can just get through till the summer, in the summer, a lot of viruses have a much more difficult time spreading from person to person. And so that alone will slow it down a great deal. And this would give us even more time, not only the time that we're kind of hiding out and social distancing, but also it would give us, hopefully through the summer, to develop and implement a vaccine so that we can have this acquired immunity and this herd immunity. Also, if we can just slow down the rate of transmission to a pace that the health system can handle, we'll never run into that problem like in Italy where we overrun our health system. The problem with this is really just that it will cripple our economy. We will just shut everything down essentially. Small businesses will fail everywhere. We've never seen a blow to the economy like this, and especially the world economy in this way. And the consequences of that could be tremendous. It also still doesn't give us herd immunity. We won't have herd immunity potentially for a long time. So the hope is that we make it that far. But the reality is if we just slow it down quite a bit, where not very many people get COVID-19, and then we all go back to work and start behaving at least somewhat like we were behaving before, we're just as susceptible to a massive outbreak as we were before. And so there could be a huge second wave that could be even greater than the first, though it might be slowed down to some degree by summer. There's a third approach that I don't think is being very fairly represented, and that is the approach to lock down really vulnerable populations. And I mean really lock them down. Just keep them completely isolated from the rest of civilization, and then to have everybody else carry on essentially like normal. This means that there will be a lot of people in low-risk groups that will get the disease. It also means that the population will fairly quickly develop herd immunity because everybody's going to get it, and they won't have to shut down their economies. But there's a big difference between being low risk and being no risk. And so many people are still going to die in this plan, especially considering the fact that this will almost certainly overwhelm the healthcare system. And so you will have a lot of people who weren't in high risk demographics, but now they are because they can't get treatment. It's basically the same solution we had for the chickenpox until the vaccine was developed, which is just, let's carry on. If we find out somebody's got it, go get it and get it over with. And everybody had herd immunity. The big difference here is that it's like nobody'd ever had chickenpox before and we're all getting it at the same time. This is pretty much the only solution that is really guaranteed to work. It doesn't even require a vaccine to ever be developed to work, but it also virtually guarantees that the healthcare system will be overrun in your country. The other solutions are not guaranteed to work. All they do is slow the virus down so that hopefully the population can either gradually develop herd immunity through low levels of infection or a vaccine can be developed. But they both leave us wide open to the possibility of a second wave if we go back to work too soon. Which of these solutions is the best is way outside of my pay grade. But the reality is that each of these solutions really only works if we're all united about it. Because the reality is if we just carry on, everybody's saying stay in your house and you're like, nah, then it's going to continue to spread, and we'll have shut down the economy. Tons of people are going to lose their jobs. Tons of people are going to be staying home, and it's still going to be spreading like wildfire because there are a large percentage of people that are carrying on as usual. You got to go all in on one of these if you're going to have a chance. This honestly is a period of global unity unlike anything I've ever seen. Humans are a very tribal species, but we seem to band together really well when we face some sort of large extrinsic threat, like in the movie Independence Day. Well, this is our alien invasion. It's going to be hard for all of us, but I pray that this is something that we all take as an opportunity to look past our petty differences with one another and really become united as human beings. We at Clint's Reptiles, we will be here for you. You are not alone, even though at the moment you might be. We are all fellow travelers on this journey, and this is going to become part of our shared human experience for a long, long time. And hopefully it will bring us together. I want you to know how much we love all of you. We are grateful for you, and let's do this together. As always, like and subscribe. Feel free to comment if you have questions or you'd like me to clarify anything. I want, just like we do with pet reptiles, I want you to have the information so you can make informed decisions. Because I believe in you and your capability to be wise when you have the right knowledge. Gus is also hypersensitive to he can see people and he wants to come hang out. That is good tip.
Animals.
Good tip. Don't smooch your sick ferret. Hang in there, everybody.
We're gonna be okay.
Except for you extroverts, your host.
Yeah.
Hang in there. We got this.